Welcome to Political Frontline. My special guest today is a Senior Fellow of the Jamestown Foundation in Washington D.C, Vladimir Sokor. Vladimir, welcome to Political Frontline.
Nice to be here.
Thanks you are with us. Vladimir, as you know, there's many rumors about delivering weapons in Ukraine, I mean lethal weapons. Does the Ukraine has a chance to get lethal weapons in the near future?
Hard to tell. The debate is going on in Washington and in Europe. I don't believe that the Obama administration will make a decision anytime soon to deliver weapons. I'm not using the term lethal weapons. Weapons are lethal by definition. There is lethal equipment and non-lethal equipment. Equipping an army with non-lethal equipment only is a joke. That is no army. And that is no policy from the United States or from NATO countries. Either they are serious or they are not serious. And Ukraine does need defensive weapons. Lethal, of course, because you don't win wars without weapons. You don't even hold your adversary to a draw without weapons. And the mission of the Ukrainian armed forces is to avoid further territorial losses. It is not to remove the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics armies from where they are. They are far too strong to be defeated and removed because the Russians armed them and the Russians were serious. The Obama administration is not serious, the Russians were serious. And they armed the so-called People's Republics effectively. They are superior. What the danger that Ukraine faces is to lose more territory, not in a dramatic way, not by means of large-scale, massive offensive of conventional forces with columns of tanks moving over, no. In a much less visible way, in which the so-called People's Republics, in fact Russian forces, would overrun today one checkpoint, tomorrow another checkpoint. For example, on the Bakhmut road, they would move from checkpoint 31 to checkpoint 30 and then to checkpoint 29. Or as they did about a week ago, they would move, cross a bridge from the southern bank to the northern bank of the Seversky Donetsk. Or they would win a few more villages to the west of Mariupol, not east, but west of Mariupol, in a way which always does not present Ukraine or the West with a massive case of aggression, but rather is biting off small chunks of territory, like a salami, slicing one little slice one at a time, in a way that Ukraine cannot respond with massive force. The West will close its eyes to this, and so Ukraine loses territory. And this is what has happened after Minsk I, armistice, which was signed in September 2014. Between that time and Minsk II in February 2015, the Russians advanced in that way.
Okay, what are the main fears and obstacles, I mean, for delivering the US weapon? This is fear of Obama, or this is like...
In the United States, a majority of the US Congress, including a majority of the Democratic Party, Obama's party in the US Congress,
so they are weak.
Is in favor. No, they are in favor. A majority of both parties in the US Congress is in favor of delivering defensive weapons to Ukraine. The Pentagon is in favor. And in the State Department, everybody except John Kerry, Secretary of State, is in favor. So there is a majority of American officialdom in Washington in favor of arming Ukraine with defensive weapons. The big holdout is the White House, is the Obama White House. This is the big holdout. And in Europe, of course, the big holdout is Germany. There are a few individual European countries who would be willing to deliver defensive weapons to Germany, to Ukraine. But they would not do so unless one big and influential country starts doing it. For any individual country to do so would be to risk the displeasure of Russia. It is a risk. And anyone, even Poland, would argue such risks have to be shared.
do they all believe in diplomacy way or not?
Well, I think this is a very unprofessional way of putting the issue, especially from the side of Germany. To some extent also from the side of the Obama White House, but especially from the side of Germany, a very unprofessional way of putting the issue. They say this conflict can only have a political solution. But in fact, any conflict anywhere in the world always ends in a new political situation, which is a solution, a political solution. In our case here in Ukraine's east, the problem is that Russia is creating a new reality with military means. It's not a political solution, it's a military solution that Russia is enforcing unilaterally. And then somebody, Germany in the first place, would ratify this military solution by giving it a political formulation, and they call it a political solution.
It's some, it's some kind of a cirque when you are sitting in the circus and you look into the show and it always ends.
Yeah, you can say it.
Happily.
You can say it's a circus. You can say it's a circus, and it's totally unprofessional. Of course, just to repeat, every military conflict sooner or later ends in a new political situation, and that is the political solution. But that solution will have been, in this case, will have been imposed militarily by Russia. And then what Frau Angela Merkel calls a political solution would be a political acceptance of the military outcome that Russia imposed by armed force unilaterally.
Some say that history repeats sometimes.
It repeats in different ways. It never repeats the same way. It repeats in different ways.
By the way, do you believe in diplomacy way of resolving this conflict?
Yes, of course. It is inevitable. It's inevitable to have a diplomatic process. And again, we have an unprofessional way or an unprofessional approach. Again, on the side
unprofessional way of Ukrainians?
Of Western powers,
of Western powers,
but especially of Germany. They are saying they cannot deliver arms to Ukraine to defend itself because that would provoke Russia to use even greater force. But this is wrong. There is this slogan in Germany which dates back to the 1960s, 1970s. It is a pacifist slogan of the Green Movement, which it's a German slogan, but in translation it rings, make peace without weapons. Yeah. So how can you make peace without weapons? To have peace, you have to have weapons in order to discourage an attack on yourself. If you don't have weapons, you encourage an attack on yourself and you won't have peace. In the case of Ukraine, Russia will not undertake a massive military offensive, like big tank columns crossing the border, thousands of soldiers attacking. They will not do that because that would mean more economic sanctions from the West. And it would unify the European Union. The European Union is divided. The Russians want to keep it divided. A big Russian offensive would unify the European Union around sanctions. So the Russians would continue, as I mentioned a moment ago, taking small bits of territory one by one, until forcing Ukraine to come to an armistice in order to stop this process. This is what happened in Minsk I and in Minsk II. Every time Ukraine was forced to come to sign an armistice to stop this small process of slicing small bits of Ukrainian territory. So we had Minsk I, we had Minsk II, and this can continue with Minsk III. I read here, while visiting Ukraine, I read commentaries by Ukrainian analysts predicting that if things continue in this direction, you may have a Minsk III, in which each Minsk agreement, 1, 2, then if there is a 3, the conditions have been worse for Ukraine every time, as a result of small-scale but relentless Russian attacks.
So all this diplomacy way is just damaging the Ukraine.
It's damaging Ukraine as long as Ukraine cannot defend itself. But if Ukraine can defend itself at the low level of hostilities, the Russians are conducting low-intensity hostilities. If Ukraine can defend itself at that level, then we will stop this process of Minsk I, Minsk II, somebody says Minsk III, and President Putin said very soon after Minsk II, President Putin said, we may have Minsk III, but it's not needed yet.
When it will be needed, we will make it.
Yeah, yeah. That's the implication. So to stop this Minsk I, II, maybe III and IV process, Ukraine needs defensive weapons to conduct military operations the way the Russians conduct them, at a low level of intensity. They will not escalate to a high level of intensity, for the reasons that I mentioned.
Do you believe that Donbas region and Lugansk region has a bright future?
No, I think they have a desperate future. We don't know yet what the future will be, but they are economically in a relatively backward state. Of course, on the one hand, these regions were the main generators of Ukrainian exports. That is true. In the context of the Ukrainian economy, these regions were the main earner of foreign currency and the main export generator. That's important. But in an international context, or even in a Russian context, those industries would be uncompetitive without massive foreign investment. The Ukraine-European Union Association Agreement and the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement would have opened the way for massive European investments in Ukraine. Also possibly American investments, but in the first place European investments. The Russian-occupied parts of the Donbass now have no hope of getting European investments. Their industries might be taken over by Russian industrial capital. They might be swallowed by the big sharks of the Russian industry, which, by the way, is something that Ukrainian industrialists wanted to avoid. People like Rinat Akhmetov and other industrialists in Donbass, when they were part of Ukraine.
Vladimir, about that we'll talk on our second part of the program.
We'll continue.
My special guest today is a Senior Fellow of the Jamestown Foundation in Washington, D.C., Vladimir Sokor. Vladimir, let's talk about the international support of Ukraine. What are international instruments that Ukraine should engage?
I'm not sure I understand the question exactly.
I mean, what are the international instruments that are still not engaged and Ukraine should engage these instruments?
I think Ukraine is doing pretty well. I think Ukraine is using the available instruments pretty effectively, the current government. But the current government has inherited a bad situation from the past, from past Ukrainian governments, but also a bad situation from the point of view of the situation in Europe, the policies of NATO and the European Union. And that is the worst handicap for Ukraine, is the mission of the OSCE in Ukraine.
Do you believe in OSCE?
No, not at all, not at all. The OSCE is playing entirely in Russia's favor. I have been following the OSCE at work, not long before it came to Ukraine. I followed it at work in Moldova and in Georgia. It has always played in Russia's favor. The OSCE operates by consensus, by internal consensus. Russia has veto power inside the OSCE. Any decision of the OSCE has to be pre-negotiated with Russia inside the organization. The OSCE cannot take a step, cannot make a declaration without prior approval by Russia inside the organization. Moreover, all OSCE missions now in Ukraine, prior to this in Georgia, Moldova, Karabakh also, the OSCE missions operate on the basis of a mandate. The mandate is a big document which tells that mission exactly what to do and what not to do in great detail. That mandate is always negotiated with Russia, and Russia is able to shape that mandate the way it sees fit. To give some concrete examples, The OSCE mission here in Ukraine, which is supposed to monitor and verify the ceasefire and the troop movements, they have a grand total of only 4 unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, because Russia did not allow more than 4. The OSCE mission wanted to have many more than 4. It needed tens and dozens, but Russia allowed them only 4, and it's only 4. They only had 300 observers. They wanted 1,000. Russia allowed them 300 because Russia does not want the OSCE mission to see what's going on in the field.
Do you really think that amounts of the observers will help the situation? 300, 400, it takes no matter.
Now, I think it will grow by another 500, but it will not be by far enough. Moreover, many of these are Russians. Many of these extra observers will be Russians, and they don't have enough unmanned aerial vehicles. Some of those that they do have, they cannot operate at night. A lot of Russian troop movements are taking place at night. Many of them cannot operate in winter because they are freezing in winter. The so-called People's Republic's forces have shot at those UAVs, and even they shot down one. They are now down to 3 instead of 4 because one of them was shot down, and others were shot at just as warnings, as threats.
Just don't go there, yes?
Yeah. So this is a joke. It is another joke because this is how the OSCE operates. And by the way, the budget of these missions is also subject to approval by Russia. Everything is a mandate.
So no money, no funny.
Yeah. So everything is a mandate. These small technical details. The Russians are very tough at negotiating these very small technical details. It would be a completely different matter if we had an European Union mission, because Russia does not have decision-making powers in the European Union. In the spring of 2014, just as the Russians were starting to infiltrate Donetsk and Luhansk, just when the first infiltrators were coming in, without heavy weapons yet, the European Union considered the possibility of sending a European Union mission, which would not have depended on Russia. Russia would have had no decision-making role in that. But this was voted down in the European Union by a group of countries led by Germany, specifically led by Germany's foreign minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier, because of Germany's idea that security in Europe has to be cooperative with Russia. This is a concept that Germany is a champion of in the European Union. Cooperative security. That is, in all security issues on the European continent, Russia should cooperate, should play a role, should participate in decisions alongside the European Union. And because Russia does not have a direct vote or voice in the European Union, the instrument to achieve this cooperative security is the OSCE. And this has been the tragedy of Moldova and of Georgia, and it is now a tragedy for Ukraine.
Do you believe that, do you have your own recipe just for resolving this conflict?
No, nobody has their own recipes, but I would have some recommendations to make. And these recommendations are, I'm afraid, pretty tough, and my recommendations would recognize a very disadvantageous situation on the ground. And it is as follows. Ukraine has at all costs to avoid the inclusion of the so-called People's Republics in the political space and the institutions of Ukraine. This is what Russia wants now. Initially, Russia had a different policy. It had the Novorossiya project, which would have meant the dismemberment of Ukraine, taking away as many as 8 oblasts. I call them provinces. I don't call them oblasts. I call them provinces. Yeah. So the Novorossiya project implied simply taking away 8 provinces from Ukraine and making some kind of separate state. But this has collapsed because the Novorossiya project found no popular support where there were no Russian troops.
Clear.
It found popular support only when Russian troops entered, and that is in parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces. Not because of the population, but because the Russian troops entered there. But except for this, the Novorossiya project collapsed. And since about October of last year, Russia has changed its policy. It now wants to bring those parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, the occupied part, back into Ukraine. It wants to bring them back to Ukraine, to include them in the so-called political space of Ukraine, that is the legal framework, institutional framework in the constitution of Ukraine, with a special status which would give them the possibility, not only local autonomy, it would give them the possibility to influence decisions at the central level of government in order to derail Ukraine's advance towards the West. So this is Russian policy now. Ukraine has to do everything to avoid that those Russian occupied and Russian satellites are coming back into Ukraine's political institutions. This is why I approve and I applaud the decisions taken by the Verkhovna Rada on March 17th of this year, which practically rule out, exclude any political role for the so-called People's Republics inside Ukraine. They exclude that, and that's very good, and I approve it. Now, what you have to do, next step, is to control very strictly the demarcation, the military demarcation line that separates the Russian occupied territory from the territory controlled by Ukraine. You should never call it a border. It's not a border. The occupied territory is your territory. Therefore, that cannot be a border, and you should always say this is not a border. It is a technical military line of demarcation. But that line of demarcation must be controlled very strictly like a border, and moreover like a border to an enemy state, in order to prevent them from sending saboteurs, subversion, terrorists across the border, and in order to make it possible for citizens of Ukraine to travel to the European Union without visas. You don't control...
Do you really think that this is possible?
Of course it's possible. Your neighbor Moldova did it.
But our neighbor Moldova has no such issues as Ukraine.
Exactly, it has no direct border with Russia, but it has a long border with Transnistria, which is an uncontrolled territory. But Moldova has managed effectively to control not the border, it's not called a border, but the military demarcation line with Transnistria. Ukraine does not control the Ukraine-Russia border in the territory occupied by Russian troops. That territory is not controlled by Ukraine. Therefore, that part of the Ukraine-Russia border is not controlled by Ukraine. This means the Russians can do whatever they want there. They can bring in anything they want. And this means that the European Union will not allow Ukrainian citizens to travel visa-free because Ukraine's eastern border is not secure. But you can secure something else. You can secure the demarcation line in Donbass, which we will never call it a border, but you will secure it very reliably. And that will be your first step to obtain visa-free travel to the European Union. You also have to fulfill some internal technical requirements, like having biometrical passports.
We already have it.
You do?
Yes, we do.
I see. Okay. Georgia is on its way to achieve visa-free travel. Moldova has already done so, and you can do so if you are able to demonstrate that that demarcation line in Donbass is perfectly and reliably secured.
Vladimir, what's your impression about reforms in Ukraine?
I'm not an economist, so I'm not really competent to judge the issue of economic reforms. But I can discuss the issue of constitutional reforms. Here again, Russia has a goal, which is the so-called federalization of Ukraine. For a long time, the Russians called for federalization of Ukraine in order to disorganize the state. Now the Russians are saying it's not important how you call it. The content is important. You can call it, that's what the Russians say. Putin and Lavrov are saying this. You can call it confederalization, federalization, special status, decentralization, give it whatever name. What is important is for the regions of Ukraine to have a very high degree of autonomy. And what the Russians understand by having such a high degree of autonomy, this means at least two things. I mean, two things that are not normal. two things that go beyond the normal. One is for regions in the east of Ukraine, not only Donetsk and Luhansk, but any regions in the east of Ukraine.
Vladimir, on that note, our time is over.
Okay.
I'm sorry. On that positive note, my special guest today is the Senior Fellow of the Jamestown Foundation in Washington, D.C., Vladimir Sokor. Thanks for being on Political Frontline, Vladimir.
My pleasure.